Hey friends, so I'm featured in the third story of the newest episode of the No Sleep podcast. They do awesome audio horror productions, and I'll be featured in many more episodes to come down the line. So be sure to go check out my story and subscribe to their podcast, all linked down below. Enjoy the stories. From a very early age, I remember being acutely aware that my dad had a lot of money. Even when we were still living in a small 2-up, 2-down terraced house in Garston, and I had just started school, I remember feeling this deep source of pride that my dad had the best car in the street. It was the late 70s back then, and the area of Liverpool we lived in was a rough one. There was a lot of crime, a lot of unemployment, and both my parents grew up in conditions so squalid that I had to see them to believe them. But I think that's what made my dad into the man he was. Growing up, his parents didn't have 2 pennies to rub together, so by the time he was a young man, that's all he thought about. Money, money, money. I heard that he was a clever lad growing up. He did well in school and earned great results in his exams, but when it came time to pick a trade and learn a skill, Dad announced that he wanted to go to university instead. To him, getting a business or accountancy degree was the golden ticket to a lifetime of potential good earnings. But after traveling down to London for his School of Economics interview, he came back with a completely different plan. In the late 70s, when Dad started his business, Russia was known as the USSR, and it operated behind what was called the Iron Curtain. And basically this meant that there were strict export controls and massive bureaucratic hurdles on both sides if you wanted to trade with them. The process was even more tiresome if you wanted to import old Russian antiques. But since London was, and still is, home to a very large and very wealthy community of Russian expats, you could make millions selling them artifacts from a homeland they'd never returned to. And so, that's what my dad started doing. Apparently he'd gotten the idea from some old geezer in a London pub, one who'd listened to his story and decided to give him a tip. And at first glance, importing just about anything of value from the old Soviet Union was impossible. But if you had a man on the inside, someone in Russia who could grease the wheels of commerce, as they say, then suddenly piles of paperwork and months of waiting became a handshake and some cash in an envelope. And it was this man on the inside the old geezer was offering to my dad. A few weeks later, Dad's on a boat headed for Murmansk, a big Russian port city near the border with Norway. And it's there that he meets his contact, and it's there that he started his business in earnest, with the purchase of his first ever antique religious icon. It sold for a whopping £3,000, which is about $12,000 in today's money, and then factor in that he bought the icon from his contact for just a few £100, and you start to understand why he made so much money. We moved out of Garston and out to a big fancy house in Halewood when I was still in primary school. That was another source of pride for me and my little brother, and it wasn't too far from our school or friends, so there were no complaints from either of us. But the same could not be said in 1989 when I was 14 years old, and Dad announced that we were moving again. Because that time, we weren't moving to a nice big house down the road. He was moving us up to a tiny rural hamlet named Waterside on the east coast of Scotland, or basically, the middle of effing nowhere. When he first told me, I thought he was taking the piss. His business was in Liverpool, our schools were in Liverpool, and all of our friends were in Liverpool. Everything we knew and loved was there, at home. So what the bloody hell would he want to move up to rural Scotland for? I remember him sitting us down at the kitchen table, my mum, myself, and my little brother, and explaining that he'd finally earned enough money to do what he'd always wanted to do. Move up to Aberdeenshire, the land of his fathers, and live a quiet, simple life as a gentleman farmer. And what followed was like a variation of the 5 stages of grief. After initially refusing to believe it, we were furious and asked Dad things like, "How could you do this to us?" I had my first boyfriend, my little brother had his beloved scout troop, and my mom thought living up in the arse end of nowhere sounded boring beyond belief. We'd put down roots and we didn't want to be uprooted. So then came the bargaining phase as we asked if we could stay in Liverpool while he moved up to Scotland. and he said no, of course, that he was selling the house to finance the purchase of the other, and that prompted us to enter the depression phase, and then finally, acceptance. Just over a week later, Dad loaded everything into a moving truck, and then we got into the car with Mum and drove behind him all the way to Aberdeenshire. Looking back on it, the scenery once we crossed over into Scotland was incredible, but considering the mood that we were in, we couldn't appreciate it. Waterside was gorgeous too, a collection of large houses nestled on the bank of a river, but it didn't feel like home, and it wouldn't for some time. A mile down the road from Waterside was a little seaside town called Newborough. It's a beautiful little place, but back then, it felt like we'd stepped back in time by about 50 years. Aside from the church, the greengrocers, and a little coffee shop, it was just houses, ponds, and fields. There were no playgrounds, no arcades, and worst of all, no cinema. Dad took us to the grocer's and coffee shop that first day, then tried to bribe us with cake as he gave us a little pep talk. And the way he saw it, I'd only have to live there for 4 years, in a nice quiet place like that with none of the distractions of the big city, and I could focus on getting the best exam results possible. That way, when I got into my first choice of uni, I could drink, smoke, and go clubbing as much as I liked, and he wouldn't be there to stop me. And I'll admit, the prospect gave me a bit of hope. I could keep in touch with my mates on the phone, visit them whenever we drove back to Liverpool to see my gran, and then in 4 years, I could ace my way into Liverpool Uni and be back home where I belonged. My little brother adjusted quite quickly too, especially once he found out Newborough had a scout troop of its own. And then over the next month or so, we all slowly adjusted to our new lives up there in the Scottish countryside. I started school not long after moving, and despite my abject terror that I'd be some freakish English loner, I made friends with a couple of Scottish girls quite quickly. We'd go walking on the beaches together, which was another thing about Newborough and Waterside that really won me over. Then we'd walk back into town to grab coffee together at the place with the really good cake. And then one day, as I was enjoying my tea and cake, my friend Nicola leaned over with her eyes on the table and whispered, "That man is looking at you." And I felt my heart rate pick up a bit when she said it, and then she added, "Behind you. He keeps looking over here at us, but mostly at you." She leaned back, then casually continued with whatever she was saying prior, but I couldn't match her calmness. I turned in my seat, pretending to look at the menu board behind the counter, and there he was in my peripheral vision. I half caught him looking when I turned too. Nicola was right. I turned back, then quietly asked Nicola if she recognized him, and she said no. She knew everyone in Newborough and knew a new face when she saw one. There was a stranger in town, and he'd taken an interest in me. As you can imagine, I was not flattered. I was 14, and this guy looked to be in his 20s or 30s, way too old for a girl my age, so the first thing that came to my mind was perv. But then, if he didn't live in town and he didn't live up in Waterside, then he was a perv that I wouldn't have to worry about once I'd finished my cake. And the thought calmed me down for a bit, though it was still not very pleasant having to eat knowing his eyes were stuck to me. And once we'd finished, we'd thanked the owner and walked out of the coffee shop, only to realize that the man was following us. Nicola swore that it was her sixth sense kicking in, but as we were walking down the lane, she looked over her shoulder, then turned back and said, "He's following us." My instinct was honestly to run, not to confront the guy, but Nicola turned around and started asking him, bold as brass, "Are you following us, you perv?" He was tall, with dark hair and a dark jacket, and he had sunglasses on even though it was pretty overcast that day. For a second, a part of me thought that he was going to reply with, "I'm just walking to my car, love," or something like that, in which case we'd made a total scene over nothing. But instead, the man just kept on silently walking towards us. Nicola and I got very nervous as he got close, but then he just sort of passed us. He didn't look at us, he didn't talk to us, he just walked right past us and carried on down that lane. Nicola and I were just stood there for a second like, what was all that about? We had zero clue why he hadn't just reacted to a 14-year-old girl calling him a perv, but what we were certain of is that we weren't about to walk the same way as him, even if our houses were in that same direction. Instead, Nicola and I walked back into town and sat in the coffee shop for about half an hour before attempting our walk home for a second time. We walked together for a while, talking about this and that until we parted ways, and I was then faced with crossing the bridge over the river alone. But right as I was about to cross the river, I spotted someone in the car park just off the left of the bridge. It was the man from the coffee shop, the one with the sunglasses, and it looked an awful lot like he was watching me. When I got home, I told my mom about him and how creepy it felt knowing that I was getting stared at. She said the man was just a tourist by the sounds of things, as they often drive up the East Coast, stopping here and there on the way. She also said that, unfortunately, unwanted gazes were something everyone had to deal with from time to time. Men stare at women when they're being lecherous, she said, and they also stare at each other when they're trying to start trouble down in the pub on a Saturday night. In both cases, the solution were the same. Avoid the stare at all costs and leave if you feel unsafe in any way. Mum laughed when I told her about Nicola calling the guy a pervert and said that she liked the sound of her. And then I took a lot of reassurance in the fact that I was never going to see that guy again. But then, just a few days later, I did see him again, and he basically did the exact same thing. I'd walked into town on my own, then went into a minor panic when I saw him standing in a shop doorway wearing those same sunglasses and that same black jacket. I prayed that he wouldn't follow me again, but he did, and I did the same thing of doubling back and trying to lose him or wait him out. I really didn't want him following me out of town, and Nicola was away visiting her granny that weekend, so I couldn't call her for backup. Instead, I ended up calling a minicab to drive me all the way home. And then luckily, by the time it arrived outside the coffee shop, the man in the sunglasses seemed to have gotten bored and had stopped following me around. I was a bit relieved and a bit annoyed because if I'd known that he was going to get bored, I'd have saved a few quid and not rang a cab. But I had a little chat with the driver on the journey and then hopped out once we crossed the bridge and I was near my house. I just collected my change and I was climbing into the back seat when I saw a car behind us. It stopped less than 50 meters back, close but not too close, and I could have sworn that I'd seen it somewhere before. Well, I had, and as the cab took off, the car followed it. It was the same car that I'd seen parked near the bridge not a few days before, and in the driver's seat was the man in the sunglasses. And for as long as I live, I'll never forget how sick I felt walking up the pathway to my house. It wasn't so much that the guy had managed to follow me home, although that indeed was bad. It was the fact that as he drove past me after I climbed out of the cab, he had this big, smarmy grin spread across his face. It was like this sick sort of victory smile, that I win, and now I know where you live look. After walking through the door, I went straight to my mom and told her what had happened. I remember how her face dropped when I mentioned the car because, like me, she realized how serious the situation had become. This wasn't just some pervy older man following a schoolgirl around the village. This guy was tracking me, following me, stalking me. Most of the time, my dad was either out playing golf or drinking down at the village pub, but on that day, he was home, so when he heard me crying to my mom, he came running. He asked what was the matter, and when I told him, I assumed he'd just be angry. I thought he'd be straight onto the phone with the police, furiously demanding they do something before he does it himself, but he didn't do that. In fact, he didn't seem even remotely irritated. Instead, and for the first time in my whole life, I saw what my dad looked like when he was scared. I first noticed it when he was asking me to describe what the fella who followed me looked like. He asked about the car, if he talked like us, and what his voice sounded like, all sorts of questions like that. But aside from his physical description, I knew nothing about him. Once I'd finished saying everything I had to say, I thought Dad would dial 999, but he didn't. He just sat there with this wide-eyed, frightened look on his face like he was trying to figure out what to do. I remember saying something like, "Dad, aren't you going to phone the police?" Then my mom joined in asking what was going on and why he was acting like that. I suppose Mom knew him long enough to be able to read what was on his face because she started asking him to talk to her and tell her what was going on in this accusatory tone of voice. Dad stayed quiet for a bit, head in his hands by then, and the more scared he got, the more scared I got. Mom started raising her voice and shouting at him, then he shouted back at her to stay quiet, and then told me to go up to my room and make sure my brother stayed upstairs too. Keeping him up there was no problem. Dad had bought him a computer and a TV for his room, so he was glued to it, playing Mario or whatever and blissfully ignorant of what was going on downstairs. Me, on the other hand, I couldn't stay put, and just a minute or so later, I slipped out of my room and stood at the top of the stairs and tried to listen in on what Mom and Dad were saying. They had the door closed downstairs, so I couldn't hear exactly what was being said, but I knew it was bad. They were trying not to raise their voices, but they were barely managing it, and although I heard them argue like that before, it was nothing like what I heard that day. Dad sounded terrified, so much so that I barely recognized his voice. Mom, on the other hand, sounded absolutely furious because she finally burst into tears. Ugly sobs, too, like she'd completely lost control. Dad cried as well, and they cried together for a minute before their voices went low again and I lost them completely. When I heard the door open downstairs, I snuck back into my bedroom. I didn't want Mom and Dad thinking that I'd been listening in on their conversation even though I had. I stayed in my room for a bit, wondering what was so terrible that they'd cried over it, and then after a while I heard footsteps coming from the stairs and Mom walked into my bedroom. She told me to pack my suitcase because we were leaving that night. She also warned me not to forget anything because we wouldn't ever be going back to that house in Waterside. Not ever. Mom then went into my brother's room and told me the exact same thing. Maybe an hour later, we were on the road, our suitcases and bags piled in the boot with some strapped to the top of Dad's Range Rover. We were driving down a narrow country lane, lined on each side by dry stone walls, and I was sitting in the back seat with my little brother. Mom and Dad were up front, not talking to each other, and there was this really tense atmosphere in the car. The tears had barely dried on Mom and Dad's faces, and my brother was furious that we were moving again, and I simply sat there just sort of shell-shocked. A few hours before, I'd popped into town to buy some stationery, then there I was, relocating for the second time in months, and somehow it was all my fault. I remember how quiet it was at first as we drove through the night, but then suddenly, I heard the sound of a loud engine revving behind us. I turned and saw a car speeding towards us up the lane with its headlights glaring. I remember shouting "Dad" to turn his attention towards it, but his eyes were already in the rear view. He gripped the steering wheel, put his foot down on the accelerator, and then the car lurched forward as he did. He was trying to outrun it, but the other car was too fast. And the next thing I remember, it was ramming into our back bumper so hard it made the car shake. My little brother started screaming, and Mom shouted something, but all I remember is leaning over in the back seat and hugging my little brother. I just didn't know what else to do. A second or two later, the dark car behind us was speeding up alongside us, and a fella I didn't recognize was leaning out the passenger window shouting something like, "Stop the car, I'm warning you, stop the car." My dad didn't even look at him. He just kept his eyes on the road, still trying to outrun them. But whatever 4x4 they were driving was much faster than Dad's. The stranger in the passenger seat leaned back into the other car, and then suddenly, he swerved beside us, trying to push us off the lane. Dad sped up, but the road twisted and our tires screeched as he struggled to keep us on the tarmac. Once we rounded the curve, the car bashed into us again, harder this time. Our car shook and Dad kept it in control, but the other car stayed close, its engine roaring as it kept trying to push us off the road. I didn't think we stood a chance, and that at any second, we were about to be pushed into a ditch or a tree and the car would flip, roll, and burn with all of us inside of it. Every single second felt like our last, and all I could do was hug my brother as he screamed. I remember closing my eyes as I lied through my teeth and told him we'd be fine, we'd be fine. Then, when I opened them again, I saw a rooftop through our car's window. A rooftop meant a building, and a building like that one meant we were near a village. Dad put his foot down, weaving through the lane's bends, and then as we got closer and closer to the village, the dark car hesitated, then started to fall back. Lights from houses appeared, and I saw a few people walking near the road. The car behind us slowed, its headlights dimming in the distance, and then it turned off onto a side path and vanished. We didn't stop. Dad just slowed down a bit as we reached the village's Market Street, and then we passed through and kept on going, driving all the way down the east coast until we got to Edinburgh. We checked into a hotel, with Mom and Dad in one room and me and my brother in another next to theirs, and then Mom and Dad continued to argue until we fell asleep. I was only 14, so I was still too young for Mom and Dad to fully explain what was going on, but I knew that there was something they weren't telling me, and I knew it was something big. And I didn't find out what that thing was until many years later when Dad ran off with another woman, to Bulgaria of all places, and Mom spilled the beans. Dad hadn't been importing antiques from Russia, or rather, not any real antiques anyways. They were all fakes, all mock-ups commissioned by Russian heroin traffickers, and they were all stuffed with plastic-wrapped packages of the substance. That was how Dad made his money. Actually made his money, I mean. He wasn't an antiques dealer, selling specialist pieces to wealthy Russian expats. He was a heroin trafficker, flooding the streets of Britain with dangerous, dirt-cheap drugs. It was all going really well for a while. He was making millions, but poured loads of it back into the community around him, which is why he was such a popular fella when we were growing up. He did that out of necessity, though, not the kindness of his heart, because he knew that flashing cash without greasing palms would have some old busybodies snitching on him in no time. We moved out of Garston, spent a few years in that nice big house in Halewood, and all the while, Dad's still raking in millions. He's not working alone, though. He's working with a network of distributors all over the country, and he's making everyone a lot of money in the process. But then one day, after his pile of money had gotten big enough, or he couldn't stomach the risk anymore, he decided he wanted to retire. He talked to his parents, laid out his reasons, and even offered to train up a replacement. But they weren't too excited with the idea of him just walking away. He was making everyone too much money for that, so instead they gave him a counteroffer. Carry on shipping in smack from Soviet Russia and keep everyone's pockets filled, or he and his family would be filling up holes on some isolated piece of farmland somewhere. Dad pretended he got the message and carried on business as usual for a while, and then one day, he just disappeared. The reason he didn't tell any of us about the move to Scotland was because he couldn't risk anyone finding out he was leaving. Then when he disappeared, every one of his former partners up and down the country sent people out looking for him. Professionals too, which was how one found us so fast. Mom had no idea how Dad really made his money, so when he finally told her, she immediately asked for a divorce. And the way she saw it, his line of work had put us in danger since the day he started, and she couldn't reconcile the fact that he'd forced her and the kids to live in that kind of ignorance. We then started the process of moving abroad, and Dad came with us for a little while, but like I said, he ended up doing a second vanishing act. Last we heard, he was living in Sofia with a woman half his age, making the most of the exchange rate on what little money he had left. And I don't hate him, not like my brother does. I just see him as a deeply flawed human being who thought that he was smart enough to game the system. He taught me a lot in life, but that lesson is the primary one. The people who think they're smart enough to do so are actually the ones too stupid or arrogant to realize they can't, because you can never game the system. The system only ever games you. My name is Kathy. I'm from New England, and I have a story from my childhood which you and your viewers might be interested in. Back when I was just 12 years old, so almost 50 years ago now, my God, my family and I moved from Providence, Rhode Island to a little town called East Corinth up in Maine. My dad had been running his construction company since before I was born, and then after it took off, he started to make some real cash and he bought us a beautiful 3-story home on Main Street. He said he did it so me and my little brother could be raised someplace with small-town values, quote-unquote. But to us, it was like stepping into another world. We went from big city Providence to a one-stoplight town where the biggest attraction was the Corinth Historical Society. And needless to say, my brother and I were not happy at first, and Mom wasn't too pleased about it either. But after just the first few days in Corinth, we started to take a real shine to the place, so to speak. The food at the local diner was fantastic. There were basketball courts near our house, and the peace and quiet you got at night out there was amazing. Everyone in town was really welcoming too. The local pastor came over the day we moved in. Our new neighbors left gift baskets, and when the weekend came, 2 girls from the house across the street knocked on our door asking if I wanted to come hang out. Their names were Jenny and Joy, age 14 and 12, and they walked me over to the basketball courts to show me where kids hung out on weekends. There was the softball field, the 2 basketball courts and the tennis court, and then a big wall of trees with some woods behind them. Jenny and Joy said everyone's parents were cool with them hanging out there because everyone could keep an eye on them from the street. But we were never to walk beyond the woods, and that reason had a name. Trent Baxter. According to Jenny and Joy, the Baxters lived in the Manor Road apartments on the other side of the woods, and 15-year-old Trent was the biggest bully in all of the county. His dad was in jail, I guess, and his mom was a drunk, and young Trent had been so badly behaving in school that he'd been removed from the school system altogether around age 12. He used to get into fights with other kids, throw chairs at his teachers, and one time, they said, he even drowned the class hamster by trying to flush it down the toilet. Luckily, Trent knew better than to go wandering around our street or near the basketball courts, because every time he did, the town councilman would see him from his office and threaten to call the town sheriff. As a result, Trent mostly moped around the woods near the Manor Road apartments, setting rabbit traps and starting fires. And I appreciated the heads up, but since Trent didn't hang out at the courts and he didn't go to school, I didn't think that he'd be any sort of problem for me. But I could not have been more wrong. It was during our first meeting that Jenny and Joy gave me their general warning about the Baxters. Then that Friday, they walked across the street and asked if I wanted to come hang out with them and some other kids down at the basketball courts. And it was here that I got my second and more specific warning about Trent. Down at the courts, a kid named Stevie told me that when Trent found out a new family had moved into town, he was furious. Stevie also lived at the Manor Road apartments, but unlike Trent, he wasn't a predatory miscreant who broke, burned, or stole everything that wasn't nailed down. He'd come hang out on a Friday and a Saturday night, often with tales of Trent's trials and tribulations over at the apartments. According to Stevie, Trent would target an older widower who lived on the ground floor, banging real loud on his door because he knew the guy had a heart condition. He'd also target his neighbor's cats and dogs, and there was a rumor that he fed one a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, with ground-up glass as the secret ingredient. But that Friday night, and to my absolute horror, I learned Trent's newest target was my family. And like I said, Stevie mentioned Trent being furious when he heard we'd moved into town and had overheard him saying that he was going to burn our house down. Jenny and Joy, along with these other kids, assured me that Trent said stuff like that all the time, directed at just about everyone, but only rarely did he go through with any of his threats. I'd like to be able to say that reassured me, but if Trent really was just all bark and no bite, how had he managed to earn such a bad reputation? That evening, after I returned home from hanging out at the basketball courts, I told my mom what I'd heard about this Trent Baxter threatening to burn down our house. She'd also heard stories about the Baxters from some of the neighbors that had stopped by our place. Some pretty frightening things, too. But she knew that the people in East Corinth were mostly good, salt-of-the-earth folks who wouldn't allow the Baxters to terrorize anyone, let alone the newest arrivals. And that was a lot more reassuring than anything the kids at the basketball courts said. I still really appreciated them being so welcoming, but nothing sounds truer as when it's coming from Mom, right? I figured the whole Trent Baxter situation might be a storm in a teacup, so to speak. But again, I was wrong. One night, about a week after moving into our new home, I woke up in the middle of the night to a very loud crash coming from downstairs. My dad grabbed his gun from the closet, ran downstairs to see what was happening, and then walked into the family room to find someone had thrown a brick through the window. And attached to the brick was a note saying, "Move," and that's all it said. Dad reported the incident to the county sheriff the next day, who sent out a deputy who'd grown up just north of town. Deputy Daniels said that he was familiar with the Baxters and would try to ascertain Trent's whereabouts from the previous night, but he also said it probably wouldn't be easy. As I already mentioned, it was known around town that Trent's dad was in jail and wasn't coming home anytime soon. According to the deputy, Trent's mom wasn't so much a sedentary drunk as she was a wanderer. She disappeared for days at a time, and if you did manage to catch her, there was no guarantee she'd remember the exchange the next time you talked. Apparently, Trent often ran off and slept in the woods whenever he was in trouble, and his mom was more concerned with chasing bottles and boyfriends than she ever was with her own son. Finding him would be much easier said than done, and even if he did find him, Deputy Daniels wouldn't be able to do anything without concrete proof that it was Trent who'd thrown that brick. The only good news the deputy had was that it was unlikely Trent would try the same thing twice. He was a spontaneous kid of spitefulness, not a focused one, and as long as we stuck it out a little, he'd eventually get bored of us and just sort of move on, he said. I remember watching them fit in a new window with my dad talking about how it was just growing pains. There's always bad people any place you go, he'd say. But here, there's just one or two, not thousands like back in Providence. And Mom agreed. She said all Trent Baxter needed was a short, sharp shock to make it clear that we were not to be messed with, and then he'd just leave us alone. Dad stayed up late a few nights, sitting in the dark in the family room, looking out of our newly fitted windows into the street outside. He didn't keep his gun with him, he just wanted to catch Trent in the act and scare him a little. But Daniels appeared to be right, and Trent never showed. At school, Joy told me that she and Jenny had heard about Trent breaking our windows, and that they were very sorry that he'd chosen to target us. It was definitely scary, having such friendly, supportive people around. It did make things easier to bear, though. Joy said the same thing the deputy did, and that if Trent ever did get a whiff that he was the prime suspect, he'd probably disappear for a few days and we'd be able to carry on in peace. And she was right in a way, because the next few days and nights went on without incident. And as I said, we got the window replaced, Dad stopped sitting up late in our dark family room, and for about a week at least, it seemed like Trent had moved on. But then, the birds showed up. One morning after realizing that we were all out of milk, Dad decided to walk down to the general store to buy a carton or two. But he took just one step out of the front door and froze. He had a Cadillac Fleetwood broom, a real beauty, but all over the hood and roof were a bunch of dead and disemboweled birds. It looked like someone had gutted them on the spot because the insides were splayed out next to them, having pulled through slits which had been cut into their bodies. Whoever had done it had taken the heads off too, and at first, they were nowhere to be found. Dad takes one good look at the cadaver-covered car, turns back around, and then walks inside the house to call the county sheriff. He then spends the next hour or so disposing of the headless birds and hosing down his Cadillac until it was spotless again. And once he'd finished, and because he'd wasted a bunch of his morning cleaning off his car and talking to the cops, Dad figured that he'd drive down to the general store in order to claw back a few minutes of his day. Dad said that he'd climb into the driver's seat, then slid his key into the ignition, but when he turned it, there was nothing but a muffled sputter from the car's engine. He said he kind of just frowned and checked the choke and then tried again, but then instead of starting like it normally would, there was a strange, high-pitched whine from the rear like air was escaping a balloon. He started to panic a little as a series of dull thumps sounded from underneath, and then suddenly there was this huge boom as something exploded out of the car's tailpipe. Dad said he jumped up and then ran around to the rear of the car, only to see blood dripping from the exhaust. And then splattered on the ground behind it were all the little heads of the dead bird that had been lying on his car. That afternoon, Deputy Daniels was back in our kitchen talking with my mom and Dad over a few cups of coffee, and he recommended that Dad park his car in the garage from then on, and that when he caught up with Trent Baxter, he'd be arrested on suspicion of animal cruelty. A brick is a brick, but hurting animals like that was exactly the kind of behavior people had come to expect from Trent the Troll, as some kids called him. He was probably laying low, said Deputy Daniels, especially after the bird incident. It was also very likely Trent was angry that we dared to call the sheriff and wanted to give us one last F.U. before he backed off for good. At least, that's what Mom and Dad had chose to believe. Yet it proved to be nothing but wishful thinking. About 2 weeks went by and we'd once again assumed that we were in the clear, when one morning, someone started banging on our door at around 8. Dad went downstairs in his slippers to see who it was, only to find the mailman, looking white as a sheet and pointing at something that sat on our doorstep. It was a plastic can of gas, along with a box of matches, and the can actually had some gas in it too. It was Trent. He was leaving us a message, and one that clearly said, "Leave, because next time I might go through with it." The appearance of that can marked the third time that Deputy Daniels came over to our house, but that time, Mom and Dad weren't quite so patient and understanding as before. I distinctly remember my dad telling him to do his damn job, and that if the deputy couldn't find a juvenile delinquent like Trent Baxter, then he was in the wrong line of work. And to his credit, Deputy Daniels took Dad's comments on the chin. He said he understood his frustration, but that it was something that most other folks have felt at some point too. Trent and his family were this dark cloud that hung over the town, and much like all the other dark clouds which pass over the state of Maine, and boy are there many, you learn to live with them. On the bright side, Trent had never burned anything down before, at least nothing as big as a house, but as you can probably guess, that didn't reassure my dad one bit. The deputies and our neighbors could be as supportive as they liked, and it was all much appreciated, but they couldn't keep an eye out for us all the time, and the nights seemed to belong to Trent. By the time the gas and the box of matches showed up on our doorstep and my dad was yelling in Deputy Daniels' face, I was starting to get really, really upset by the whole thing. After about a month of being there, I actually liked living in East Corinth. I liked my new friends. I liked the idea of starting high school there too, so the idea that some fire-obsessed, bird-murdering psycho was about to ruin all of that for us, let's just say it started to weigh on me. Especially the day when I found out Trent wanted to target me, specifically. It was a Friday at lunchtime, and I was getting myself some food in the school cafeteria when Stevie from over the road sat next to me in Joy. And right away I could tell that he had something to say, and when he did, I felt my appetite leaving as this feeling of dread crept over me. Stevie said that he'd been riding his bike out near the apartments when Trent Baxter came out of the bushes, yelling for him to stop. Stevie knew he could outpedal him if he needed to, so he stopped and asked him what his problem was. Trent asked Stevie if he's friends with the new kid, i.e. me, and then when Stevie said yes, Trent told him that the new kid was, and I quote, dead meat. Since we hadn't got the message about leaving town, Trent was going to have to up the ante, and upping that ante meant targeting me. I was terrified, and the only thing that stopped me from descending into a full-on panic were Joy and Stevie's reassurances. They promised me that if I came to hang out with them that evening after school, they'd do anything and everything to protect me from Trent. Bullies like that were only ever successful if they could isolate someone, when there wasn't that strength in numbers. So if I stuck with them, Trent wouldn't be able to touch me and I'd be fine. What I felt in that cafeteria was one of the most bittersweet moments of my whole life. I don't think that I've ever been so scared of someone before, but I'd also never experienced such kindness and acceptance before either. I was so grateful that I was holding back tears by the time I gave Joy a hug and thanked her for all that she and her sister had done for me, in terms of making me feel welcome, introducing me to my new friend group, and most importantly, protecting me from the town's resident psycho. When I got home from school that afternoon, I told my mom everything Stevie and Joy had said in the cafeteria. She said that I was really lucky to have such nice new friends, but if I saw Trent at any point during that evening, I was to run home immediately so that her and Dad could call the sheriff. She had no doubt that my nice new friends could keep their eyes out for him. She even figured they'd try and defend me if need be. But the bottom line was that at the first sign of trouble, I should just walk or even run away. And that way, I could avoid any trouble before it even started. I remember suggesting that if a deputy or town councilman saw Trent doing something violent, then they could actually do something about him instead of just beating around the bush all the time and letting him run riot. I mean, sure, I might end up with a few bruises and a black eye, but if that's what we needed to get Trent out of the picture, then maybe it was a price worth paying. And Mom gave me a very concrete no to that suggestion and explained that violence in the movies is a hell of a lot different to violence in real life. Only in the movies did people walk away from fights with nothing but a split lip and a good story, In real life, one punch was all it took to put one person in the ground and the other in jail for the rest of their lives. Mom wanted to see this Baxter kid punished, just like everyone else in town did, just not at the expense of her only daughter. And late that afternoon, around 5:30, Jenny and Joy stopped by our house, and then we walked down to the basketball courts to hang out again. All of the usual kids were there, either shooting some hoops or riding their bikes around the courts, and although I was kind of tense at first, I soon started to relax as we fell into the usual rhythm of things. Maybe an hour into hanging out, I was really enjoying myself, and I'd also totally forgotten about the whole Trent thing when Stevie comes riding his bike across the fields away from the woods shouting, "Trent's coming! Trent's coming!" Everyone kind of flew into a panic for a second because this one older kid, Ryan, started yelling about how he was sick of running and how we should fight back for once instead of just going to get the adults. I didn't like the sound of that, not after what my mom had said about avoiding violence. But most of the other kids, instead of just leaving, latched onto what Ryan said and were basically saying stuff like, "Yeah, let's get him." I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like something out of a movie, and beside me, Jenny and Joy were both saying, come on, let's go make sure he leaves you alone." It was odd, but I thought about the smashed window, the birds, and that can of gas, and I got angry. I loved my new home, and I wasn't about to let some scumbag ruin it for me. Ryan and the other kids started storming across the field, yelling about how they were going to kick Trent Baxter's ass. It was the bravest thing I'd ever seen, and as I watched, I stood up and then told Jenny and Joy, "All right, let's go." And they were smiling and clapping, and then, after following me over to the field, we ran to catch up with the kids ahead of us. When we got to the tree line, we kind of fanned out a little and then started looking all over for this Trent character. We walked deeper and deeper into the woods, and the setting sun in the sky was ahead of us, but since we were together, we weren't very scared. I remember stopping at one point and looking around. If Trent Baxter had been in those woods, he sure as heck wasn't there anymore. And I turned to Jenny, Joy's older sister, and then said something like, Look, he's gone." But the way she was looking at me was wrong. Very wrong. I know I'd only known her a few weeks, but I'd never seen her make a face like that before. Yet it wasn't just her that was staring at me with very cold eyes. It was everyone. I turned around in the spot and realized that they all started walking towards me. And then right behind me, I heard Jenny say, "That's where you're wrong. Trent Baxter's right here." And I turned just in time for Jenny to shove me backwards into the dirt as she yelled, "Here!" And I fell on my butt, but the pain of her turning on me dwarfed any I felt from the impact. I asked her what she was doing, but she didn't answer. And then I heard someone yell something terrible about me from my right, before someone kicked me in the side of the head. I immediately went down, clutching my head, and that's when everyone jumped in and started kicking me. "Trent Baxter's right here," someone repeated, and the others laughed, but they never stopped kicking me. All I could do was just lie there, shielding my head from those blows, while I felt their sneakers and shoes smashing into my arms and my ribs and my back and my butt. I soaked it all up until someone tried stamping on my head, and that's when I realized I had to move. I felt like if I didn't, they'd kill me. I managed to make it to my knees before someone shoved me down again. Then the stamping and kicking and punching continued for a minute until I kind of just threw myself forward and made it to my feet again. That time I was able to run. They tried kicking my legs out from under me, but it didn't work, and I was able to get a real sprint going. The kids ran after me, and I remember looking over my shoulder, seeing them, and then feeling this surge of adrenaline take hold of me. And I ran, and I ran, and I ran, until I was all the way back to my street, before I realized that I wasn't being followed anymore. I remember looking back over my shoulder again and thinking, where the hell are Jenny and Joy? They lived just over the street from me, so wherever they'd run to, they hadn't been home. But then as I got closer to my house, I could see people gathered outside, and when I saw who it was, my heart sank. It was my mom, one of the ladies who lived across the street from us, along with Jenny and Joy. I was still in so much shock that when my mom ran over to escort me into the house, I didn't say anything. I wanted to get the blood off of me, get the dirt out of my mouth, and I didn't want to look at Jenny or Joy for a single second longer than I had to. Then as Mom sat me down and got out the Band-Aids and antiseptic wipes, she kept saying to me, "Trent Baxter's going to pay for this, sweetie. You just wait and see. The only folks they're going to be moving out of this town are him and his mom when they're carted off to jail." I didn't know how to tell her right away. I didn't even cry at first. I just sat there quietly letting her wipe the blood from my face and hands, almost like the calm before the storm. I was in shock. And a few hours later, after I'd cried my eyes out finally and gotten a long hot bath, I walked into the TV room and just told her straight up, "Mom, it wasn't Trent Baxter who beat me up. It was the kids who hang out at the basketball courts. It was all of them." And she was stunned. And if you hadn't already guessed, Jenny and Joy had ran ahead of me to tell everyone it was Trent Baxter who'd ambushed me after I'd wandered into the woods. So, to have me telling her something different, and that in fact there might not even be a Trent Baxter to begin with, it all came as an obvious shock to her. She was in denial at first, talked about how our neighbors had mentioned the Baxters on more than one occasion. It wasn't out of the question that a bunch of kids were all just in on some cruel joke. But the whole town. It wasn't until Dad called the county sheriff and asked to speak with him directly that he too realized something was going on. The sheriff had someone run some files, only to discover that there hadn't been a Baxter family living in East Corinth since 1934. Dad then gave him an earful about Deputy Daniels and how one of his peace officers had lied to his face about having met Trent Baxter and his mother. But when accused, Deputy Daniels played dumb and said that he was just trying to reassure the newcomers that he could keep them safe. The sheriff apologized for his deputy, saying that he was just young, dumb, and eager to impress. But Dad didn't buy it, and he too began to realize the same thing I had. There were no Baxters living in those apartments. The townsfolk had invented them. It took a few days of subtle investigation before Dad moved us back to Providence. He said he wanted to be sure before he got us packing our bags. But when he was sure, when he'd driven out to that road to ask around and was certain that the Baxters were some fabrication, we got the hell out of town and never looked back. Dad said he tried talking to the sheriff about it, and that he tried explaining how the people of East Corinth invented the Baxters as a way of terrorizing each other and terrifying outsiders. But the more he talked, the more the sheriff seemed to act like he was crazy. The sheriff said that he'd spoken to the townspeople, to the mayor and to the town councilman, and not a single person had mentioned anything about any Baxter family. It was a damn shame what was happening to that new family, they said, but as much as they wanted to help, there was nothing they could do. Once Dad realized the extent to which the townsfolk were willing to hoodwink us, he decided to quit while he was ahead and just simply get us to safety as soon as possible. And we moved back to Providence, checked into a hotel, and then stayed in an apartment for a while before Dad could find us a more permanent place to live. And we rarely speak of East Corinth, but it was always there. I guess no one wanted to remind each other or remind ourselves that the move had ever happened, but it had, and there was no getting away from it. And every so often I thought about that area and why people acted the way they did. I guess the idea of the Baxter family was something they used to blame all their problems on at first. And then maybe over time, the Baxters became something they'd use to solve their problems, namely the problem of newcomers, and how to keep them out of their town for good. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, don't eat corn the long way.